function for app component. We use this trick again to put sign out, save note, and remove note in this variable actions, and then we can pass it into our route or into our component like that. We have a switch in here, and then instead of putting route, we have private route and public route, which I told you we wrote. But if you look at the props it receives, it looks a lot like regular route, right? Path equals something. Path equals something. And down here underneath private route and public route, we have a normal route. But all of these have render. None of them have component. If you remember yesterday and when you did your homework that you totally did, you passed that component prop to route, and then that was the one it would render, right? What if you wanted to get some props into that component? That doesn't give you a way to do it, does it? It's going to get a few props from the router itself. It's going to get history and match and all that stuff. But there's no way for you to pass your own props to the component that you specify in the component prop on route. So there's another way to do it. The render prop. The render prop takes a function that is just like any other render function. You just put some JSX in there. So this route, instead of saying component, has a render prop with this method that returns redirect to notes. Now that is a built-in component in React Router that you just happen not to have used yet. But you can take a pretty good guess what it does, right? So in the switch, the default case, if it doesn't match either of these, is just to redirect to /notes. Cool. So let's look at this private route, public route business. So we're using a technique here called composition. And in the context of React components, what that means is we're making a component whose job it is to return another component. Who can guess what the purpose of these is? Who can guess what the difference between public route and private route is? What does it sound like? Yeah, Nick.
It's two different routes, and one of them is for when you're signed in, one of them is when you aren't signed in.
Yeah, one's for when you're signed in, and one's for when you're not. So if it's a private route, it requires authentication. And there's nothing built into the route component in React Router to do that for us. So we could have put an if right here in the JSX, but this is a little easier to figure out, a little easier to read, as long as we've already done the work to write those other components. But once we've written them once, we can reuse them over and over, maybe even across different projects. So let's look at how they work. Notice we pass in path, we pass in render just like we would with a normal route, but we also passed in auth, which is just the result of our auth function, true or false. Let's look at it. They're both inside a file called route helpers. Fair warning, this is a little complicated. So don't feel bad if this blows your mind a little bit. But it's kind of cool. And it's a technique that, in a complex app you might use. So private route. We have a list of props here inside our curly braces. What's with this business about? I think we did this in one of our simpler ones out here too. Yeah, maybe not. Anybody remember what that would do? So we say component, render, auth, inside the curly braces, inside the argument list of a component, a functional stateless component. We know that it grabs those props specifically out of the list of all props and sets them to local variables. This then gets all of the rest of the props, all of the ones that we didn't explicitly name. In this case, because, as discussed, what this thing is ultimately going to do is return a route. We want to make private route and public route work just like route, so you can pass all of the same props to them that you would a normal route. So we're going to make sure that we have all of the props that you passed so that we can pass it on to the route that we return. So, return route. We just return some JSX. That's a route. Now, inside that JSX, we have some complicated stuff going on. But first, we just pass in all of those props that aren't the ones that we explicitly needed for some other purpose. So we just pass along all those props so that you have all of the same options that you would with a normal route. Then, remember, a route can have either the component prop, where you just tell it the name of the component to render, or it can have a render function. This one has a render function. When do we need to use the render function instead of component? When we need to pass props. Because there's no way to do that if you just say component equals main or component equals note list or whatever. So the render function always receives an argument. If we look at the documentation for React Router, see this render function. This allows for convenient inline rendering and wrapping without the undesired remounting explained above. We didn't read above, but I'm sure it was very complicated. Instead of having a new React element created for you using the component prop, you can pass in a function to be called when the location matches. The render prop receives all the same route props as the component render prop. In other words, all of those routing related props that get passed on to the component that you put in there, it still gets passed to this render function. So that's what this variable route props holds. All of the routing props that get passed into the render function. Now the rest of this is a ternary, which, if you're not used to seeing them, kind of makes this a little harder to read. But things line up nicely, and it ends up being slightly easier to read than if we had done it the other way. So the part before the question mark we know is the if, right? And we said the purpose of private route is to ensure that you're logged in before you're sent to this route. Matching isn't quite enough. You also need to be authenticated. So if you're authed, then we run this line. If you're not authed, we run this line. This line's a fair amount less complicated than the one above, so let's look at it. If you're not logged in and you hit this private route, then we render this redirect component. And we redirect you to sign in. So if you try to get to a private route, any private route, when you're not signed in, it kicks you to the sign-in page. And we pass in an additional prop or some state called from with your previous location, so that if you try to go to a deeply nested page and you're not signed in and it kicks you out to sign-in page, and then you sign in, you still want to go to that deeply nested page, right? I hate it when I go to a website that requires login. It kicks me to the login screen. I log in and it just takes me to some freaking dashboard instead of the page I requested. Now, I'll tell you, this hasn't been written yet to do that thing. But this private route component has been written with that in mind. But it doesn't go all the way yet. Okay, so what if you are authenticated? Then we have to run this mess. So it's a big or statement, right? If we're authenticated, we do this or thing. So what in blazes is that trying to do? I'd like you to look at it for a second and see if you can figure out what on earth this line's supposed to do. Just look at that line by itself. Never mind the fact that it's in the middle of this ternary. If we're authenticated, we want to run this line, line 9, with that or. What's it trying to do? And don't feel bad if you can't figure it out, but take a minute and see if you can. It's tricky for sure. All right. So what the heck even is render here? Yeah, Clayton. It's a property that was passed in, right? When we called private route, we passed in this render property, which was this render function. Oops, dang it. Because we said that in a route, you can pass in one of two things, right? A render function or a component prop, right? So this is deciding which of those two things to use. So let's look at this, just the left side of the OR. Render and render invocation. Why the and? Why didn't I just write render parentheses? Yeah, Nick.
So if you already rendered, you don't want to render it again.
Good guess, because that would be a problem. That's not the reason we're doing this. Anybody else? What if you did pass in the component prop and did not pass in the render prop? And you tried to call render open close parens. There's an error message you would get that I'm sure you've already seen many times. Undefined is not a function. Have you seen that? So if you didn't pass in the render prop and you tried to run it, it would say undefined is not a function. So when you see that error message, remember, something is undefined that you don't think is undefined. So what we're trying to accomplish here is by saying render and invoke render. I don't know if you know this, but pretty much all programming languages work this way. If you have an and, paths have to be true, right? So if it evaluates the left one and it's false, it will never even bother to evaluate the one on the right. So if it runs render by itself, and that's undefined, undefined is falsy, so it will never even try to run it. And the and overall will be false, which means it's going to hit the other side of the OR. And it will return this JSX component passing in the props. Component being what we passed in with the component prop on the route. It's complicated, but by doing the work of creating this component, it means that back here we get to leave any of this if-else logic out and just say private route, which is pretty straightforward. The only thing that's tricky about the way private route is written is that it's using a render function, which you hadn't seen before. But it could have just been component equals something. Make sense? So then we also have public route, which kind of does the opposite. If you're not authenticated, then it renders the route that you passed in, the component that you passed in. And the way this is written, we didn't hard code main or sign in there. We made them flexible so that you can make any private route and public route that you wanted. So you can make any component public or private. So by using this public route, we say that if you go to the sign-in page and you are logged in, it'll take you to notes because you're signed in. There's no need to sign in. A little complicated, but kind of cool, and it's a technique that you see more as you get into some more advanced React stuff. We've only been doing React for a few days. It probably has crossed your mind that we've barely scratched the surface. So yeah, things have already gotten complicated, but there's a lot more to React than we've seen and that we'll have time to see. Tomorrow I'll point you in the direction of some other stuff that you can use to continue learning React. Don't stop here, and if you don't touch it for a year, you will forget it. So I encourage you to keep poking at it. So ultimately, this private route is going to take us to main. Main contains nav thing list. Thing list contains, note list, which contains a bunch of notes, and then the form. And the form is either blank or it has a particular note in it. Let's look at note form. Remember, component will receive props. Seth showed that to you yesterday. That runs anytime your props change. Your props or your state. We won't get into exactly what's going on here, but if we look at our return, our render function, we've got this form. We've got our trash button at the top. And then we've got an actual form element. And the form doesn't have an onSubmit. There's no submit button on that form, is there? Everything just happens as you type. So we've got onChange on the title, which is just an input. It's just an input that I've specified shouldn't have a border and should have really big text in it. And then we've got this rich text editor component, which is something that we installed from NPM. So someone else wrote that, and then we read how it works. So it has a value, which comes from state, this.state.editor value, not note.body, incidentally. And we have an onChange function. The onChange function for that rich text editor handle editor changes. It sets state and it updates the note, but it also updates this editor value thing. So the deal here is the way this particular editor works, it doesn't just give you a string of HTML. You can get that out of it, which is what we end up saving in Firebase. But it also saves the state of that component in a pretty sophisticated way. Like, it'll keep track of where you left your cursor. And it's fairly complicated. You could check out the documentation if you want to. It is called React-RTE. And it requires you to do a little more work than just like a text area or an input would. But, you know, we just figure that out by reading the documentation for that thing. It has examples. We can follow that. We can read documentation, right? So one thing that I hope you get more out of class than just here's how you use React. Because React will change. And someday maybe React won't even be cool anymore. Spend all that time learning Knockout.js. Gosh dang it. Which you've never heard of. So, you know, that's the way things go. Now, React has a lot of firepower behind it, so it may be with us for a while. But it will change. Everyone who learned React Router 3 really well was really frustrated when they released React Router 4 because it's nothing like it. Similarly, if you bothered to learn AngularJS, aka Angular 1, when they released Angular 2, which is now just called Angular, forget everything you know. It was a complete rewrite from the ground up. In fact, now you use TypeScript instead of regular JavaScript. Had to completely relearn the whole thing. It happens. So one of the best things you can get out of this is how to learn new languages and new libraries and new frameworks. How to work your way through a problem when you get stuck. So I think there's some value in seeing us work through problems. For example, if we screw something up and hit an error, seeing our process as we fix it. Among other things, it reminds you that even after you've been doing this for an embarrassingly long time, you will still get stuck. You will still run into problems. And you will face things that you don't know how to do. You fight through it. You figure out how to do it. You get good at reading documentation. You learn how to use your development tools to inspect things and figure out you know, what variable isn't what you thought it was at the time you thought it was, and stuff like that. So hopefully you pick up some of that stuff along the way too. Maybe I should have warned you that you should be picking that stuff up at the beginning. But hopefully you're clever enough to know that. Any questions about anything you saw in Noteherder? About anything I just rambled about? Got it? You're all masters now? Nobody has any questions about this stuff? Nobody's going to make fun of you for having a question. Yeah. I forgot to take it out. I saw it in delete, right? In remove. Oh, in one of the notes. Oh, right. So this rich text editor, yeah, I had a console.log statement inside the remove function. But you're talking about this one. So testing the features of this rich text editor to make sure that they worked, because this one in particular did some really goofy stuff at first. So we have bold, italic, strike through. I don't remember what this does. Oh, yeah, it puts a monospace font in, which is, okay, underline, UL, OL, ordered list, numbered list, block quote, link, remove link, normal. So this thing, so code. So to put a code sample inside your note, you can pick something, hit that, and it turns it to a monospace font. And I can't remember exactly how I got it, this double bordered thing. It's not inside a block quote, is it? How do we do that? Oh, yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, code block. And this one is normal, but monospace. Right, yeah, I was just testing the styles here. Heading large, medium, small, and code block. So if we pick this and say code block, the style sheet here renders it like that. Yeah. So, yeah, just to show that you can do that inside these notes, which is kind of cool. Good question. Anybody else? All right. The only stupid question is the one not asked, as they say. Which means you all have some very stupid questions right now. I have not dug into how exactly that is built into the editor component. So it's not something we had to go out of our way to do in the app. So I don't know. I don't know exactly how they did it. We didn't make React RTE. So that's this component that's inside Noteform, rich text editor. So that came with this toolbar that does the formatting. So we had to do a little work to make sure that stuff gets saved in state and all that sort of thing. But we got all the bold, italic, and stuff for free from that component. Yeah. So it's built using let's look it up. React RTE. Come on. Something called Draft.js. Yeah, pure React, rich text WYSIWYG editor based on Draft.js. WYSIWYG, if you don't remember, what you see is what you get. So it uses Draft.js, which is something that Facebook actually provides specifically for people to make rich text editors using React. So it's really just a framework. It's not, Draft.js isn't just a rich text editor that you can drop into your app, but you can use it to make a component that you can just drop in, like that rich text editor, one that we just used. So that's actually really cool. And so there are tons of rich text editors for the React that are based on Draft.js. So Facebook makes it themselves. So like when you edit your status updates, and I think Facebook Messenger uses it as well. That's what they're using. They're using React and Draft.js. So that rich text editor component is based on Draft.js. But someone already did the work for us of making one that works the way we wanted, so we just took that. Yep. So something else I'll point out is, like the other apps we've done in class, since we built them in class and since we had worked them out ahead of time, if you read through the commits, like they're very, I want to use the phrase happy path, which is something you hear sometimes in development. Like you design only for the happy path. In other words, if there's anything unexpected, everything just goes to heck. So you don't see, by reading our commits on these other projects, you don't see how we figured it out. You just have this illusion of, well, we knew exactly what to type at every single moment along the way. But since we realized a couple weeks ago there's no way we were going to get to this. So we didn't bother to kind of rewrite it that way. So what you see if you look at the commits on this project are actually the commits as we wrote them originally. So you see some stuff like us trying to figure out how this thing works. If you go out to, I swear I have it here. So here's Noteherder. So here's an example. Experiment with Draft.js. When we started trying to add the rich text editor, I don't even know what I did in this commit, but enough that I didn't want to lose it, so I went ahead and put it in the repo even though it wasn't quite working yet. Then you see work in progress Draft.js React RTE, and then fix rich text editor. Sometimes if you need to commit something, but you know it's still broken, you might prefix your commit message with WIP for work in progress. Yes, make it do. So in general, even when I'm just like writing something for myself, I follow my own rules for commit messages. This one, truly, I thought as soon as I finished it, I'm going to rewrite this from scratch in a more orderly fashion. So I kind of didn't maybe take quite as much care in my commit messages as I usually do. But still, by and large, they're the way I always write them. Store user data locally, extract helpers, load fonts over HTTPS. But yeah, make it do. I don't. So yeah, you can see trying to figure out how that rich text editor works in the commits. So that's out there on the same GitHub site as everything else. Thank you for finally asking some questions. Anything else? Now that the floodgates have opened. There's 2 people out there doing that. You're plotting some sort of revenge. 3. Oh my gosh. You guys are plotting something. I don't trust you. All right. In building the class? Or like this app? So the way we work together in general, he lives up here. He lives in Carmel. I live in Bloomington. So we don't get together in person that much, ordinarily. So yeah, with this class, what we kind of ended up doing was just like splitting up the projects for the most part. Like, you know, we made a list of all the topics we wanted to cover. Like we knew we needed to cover some of the basic JavaScript stuff, DOM stuff. We needed to cover basic React components. We needed to cover something more complicated with lots of props and state. We knew we wanted to do Firebase. We knew we wanted to do routing. So we just kind of made a list of projects that we could do to demonstrate all of those things, and then we just started working on them separately. And then when we wanted to work together, which we did more than the commit messages might suggest, oftentimes we would just do screen sharing over the internet. We have some things we use for that are really, really good. There's one called appear.in, which is kind of like Google Hangouts, except it doesn't suck. And we use something called Screen Hero, which unfortunately you can't sign up for anymore. Slack bought them a couple years ago, and the idea is they're going to build all that functionality into Slack and then sunset it. But so far, all they've done is like stop taking new signups. But we can invite you if you really want it. But it's a really nice screen sharing thing. It has a pretty good voice. And one of the cool things about it versus all the other things I've tried is you both get a mouse cursor, which, you know, if you don't behave yourselves, could be a problem. Because you can just steal focus from the other person. But it's also cool that you don't have to like stop and give control to the other person, and it takes 10 seconds. Instead of be like, hey, can I take control for a second? Yeah, blah, blah, blah. And you can just start typing on their machine and clicking around and stuff like that. So that's part of how we do it. Sometimes we actually do pair programming where, the two of us are looking at the same code. One of us is typing. We're both talking through it. We very frequently do that for short bursts, like, what's an example? Like, do you think I should use on change here, or should we use a ref and get that? That's a real one that we talked about. Ultimately, we show you both ways for that. But, and then you saw that he had a couple of commits separately from me on this one. Let's see, if I want to say, yeah, so noon, and then in the afternoon he continued to work on this while I think I had to do something else. But he'd been pairing with me in the morning, so he was ready to just run with it. So that's part of it. You have an avatar in GitHub, don't you? I don't know why it's not showing it to me here. On Seth's? Did you use a different email address? Huh. Yeah. Weird. Yeah, it didn't do it as you somehow. I wonder if there's a different email address in there somewhere. Anyway, that's a really good question about collaborating, and that's a pretty big topic, and one that we've spent a lot of time on because we work remotely. Yeah.
A lot of times when you're stuck, somebody else just has like enough of a different perspective that you just get unstuck pretty quick because they have a suggestion you hadn't thought of. So it's not really about who's the better programmer.
Right.
It's the fact that everybody thinks about problems differently, and so like when you're having a sticking point, it probably isn't, or at least has some suggestion you hadn't thought of for how you go next.
And sometimes it's like reminding you of something that you know you should try. Like you just didn't want to try it. At least that's what I've heard. I've no experience with that. Anything else? Okay, the entire boot camp's over. No, just kidding. Take a 10-minute break. All right.